Hello everyone, and this is Mark Goodacre's NT Pod, a podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 22. Today we are going to be looking at the anonymity of the Gospels.
At the time of recording in January 2010, I'm teaching a course on the Introduction to the New Testament at Duke University, and we've been asking one or two bread and butter questions like what is the New Testament, what are the Gospels, who wrote the Gospels, when were they written, and so on. And in a recent class on the Gospels, we looked at the question of the anonymity of the Gospels, at the fact that when you look at the actual texts of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, there's nothing in those texts themselves that say who wrote them. In other words, they don't actually ever have at any point the author bringing themselves forward, using the first person and saying, look, I, Matthew, was at this event. I, Luke, heard this from Paul, or anything like that. There's just third-person narration all the way through, a kind of detachment almost from the subject matter. It's a really curious phenomenon. It's something that a lot of people don't notice because they're so familiar with the titles that we give the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. But those titles probably aren't original to the Gospels. I mean, when Matthew sat down to write his Gospel, he didn't begin it with a big title that said, the Gospel according to Matthew. That's something which has been added by scribes at later points. And the fact that all four of the canonical Gospels have got the same sorts of titles, the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, and so on, shows that it's something which was a kind of convention that grew up as time went on in the copying of those texts. But this anonymity is a real curiosity. It's something that that kind of contrasts these Gospels with many other ancient biographies, ancient lives, which would often give their name of the author. And it's a puzzle to scholars to work out what's going on. We should perhaps point out that some scholars maintain that they're not completely anonymous. And in particular, there's a scholar called Martin Hengel who died relatively recently, a German scholar who noted that the titles of the Gospels never vary from one text to another. So, there isn't like one manuscript that has Matthew's Gospel being called the Gospel according to Kevin, or one that has the Gospel according to Mark being the Gospel according to Sharon. They're always Matthew, they're always Mark, always Luke, always John. And Hengel thinks that that's kind of significant and suggests that even though there's nothing in the actual text itself that makes an authorial claim, that nevertheless what happened was people knew who the authors of these were, and they circulated right from the beginning with some kind of knowledge of who the authors were, and that's how they got that consistency of labelling Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. I think though that Hengel's idea does have some problems to it. He doesn't really pay enough attention to the fact that the actual prose of the Gospels don't have that authorial claim, and that is something that's really quite striking. And the fact that the names Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are fairly consistent, well, completely consistent across the manuscripts, only shows that they go back to reasonably early times, because as soon as something is being sort of identified as Matthew's Gospel, it's difficult for someone else to make some other kind of surmise. As soon as you've received this thing as Matthew's Gospel, you're not really going to say, I don't think it was written by Matthew, especially given there's no contradictory evidence in the text itself. The most likely thing, in my opinion, about those things is that Matthew's Gospel gets the name Matthew. It's inferred because when you get the call of Matthew in Matthew 9, it's a different version of a story that you get also in Mark and Luke, where that character is called Levi. So it was probably that someone early on surmised that Matthew must have been the person writing the Gospel because the name of that disciple differs. It's probably something as straightforward as that. But whatever you think about the Hengel theory on this, it's important to notice that the texts themselves don't make any kind of explicit authorial claim, and that's got to be significant. There's a recent interesting article on this by someone called Baum, B-A-U-M, and he argues that the anonymity of the Gospels is something that corresponds to the Hebrew Bible, where quite often in the Hebrew Bible, if you think of the history books, things like Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, those kind of histories, that they are anonymous, and that the Gospels Gospels in some sense are trying to imitate what's going on there. I think that's actually quite an interesting thesis. And in fact, I would want to add to what Baum says by suggesting that by making their Gospels anonymous, it gives them a certain kind of authority. It gives you a sort of presentation of a narrative as having an inevitable course with an inevitable kind of goal, the unalterable result of divine activity in history. I think there's something about the anonymity that lends a kind of authority, a quiet authority to the way that they present things, rather than it looking like the perspective of just one man that's standing up and saying these things. The thing is, there is a real contrast between the canonical Gospels in the New Testament and many of the later Gospels that didn't make it into the canon. If you take the Gospel of Thomas, for example, which is probably one of the most primitive of the Gospels that didn't make it into the canon, the Gospel of Thomas actually begins with an explicit attempt to identify its author. It says, "These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down." So an explicit claim right there at the beginning of the Gospel in the text itself that has some kind of claim that the author was present and heard this privileged information. And in the case of the Gospel of Thomas, it's secret information, so it's something really special. He's making that claim. And that's common in lots of 2nd century and later Gospels. If you look at an amazing piece called the Protevangelium of James, which is a kind of prequel to the Gospels. It ends with this amazing announcement. It says, "Now I, James, who wrote this history in Jerusalem, when there arose a tumult when King Herod died, withdrew myself into the wilderness until the tumult ceased in Jerusalem." Or look at the Gospel of Peter. Just at the moment where the fragment breaks off, it says, "But I, Simon Peter, and Andrew my brother, took our nets and went unto the sea, and there was with us Levi the son of Alphaeus." And it's interesting when you look at these attributions to particular named disciples, because you really get a feel for the contrast between these non-canonical texts and the canonical texts of the New Testament. Perhaps the most explicit example of this kind of thing comes in a book called the Apocryphon of James. Because in the Apocryphon of James, you get this great line. It says, "The 12 disciples were all sitting together and recalling what the Saviour had said to each one of them, whether in secret or openly, and putting it in books. But I was writing that which was in my book, and lo, the Saviour appeared after departing from us while we gazed at him." It's fascinating to see the way that the author, let's not mince words, pretends to have been there, pretends to have made himself present in the event. And it contrasts strikingly with Matthew and Mark, which really don't have any of this kind of authorial self-representation. Well, there is a curiosity here which is probably worth pointing out, which is that although Mark and Matthew are completely anonymous, and there really is no sense of the author in any way placing themselves in the actual action using the first person or anything like that, you are actually getting some movement towards authorial self-representation in Luke and John. And I regard Luke and John as later than Mark and Matthew. I think Luke knew Mark and Matthew and suspect that John knew all three. And in Luke's Gospel, it's not there in a very strong way, but you just begin to get that movement towards authorial self-representation. He has a preface, Luke does, in verses 1 to 4 of the first chapter, where although the author doesn't tell us what his name is, he is actually clearly present in the text. And then in Luke's sequel, because he's the only one of the 4 gospel writers to have a sequel, in Luke's sequel, he has the first person plural for about half of the book. In the second half of the book, he keeps saying, "We did this and we did the other." So suddenly the author is present in the action. And in John's Gospel, there's something related as well. Again, you don't get any hint of who the author was in terms of what his name was, but you do get this kind of witness to the things that have been taken place. John 19:35, "He who saw this has testified, so that you also may believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth." And then in John 21:24, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true." So John is very much moving in the direction of that kind of authorial self-representation which you get in those non-canonical Gospels of the 2nd century. But it's not fully there yet. It's just that it's somewhere, if you like, almost like a kind of a bridging text in between Matthew and Mark on the one hand and the non-canonical Gospels, which I think are a bit later, on the other hand. It's actually one of those curious things that the Gospels that are explicit about who they claim they were written by are the ones that certainly weren't written by those people. So when the Gospel of Peter claims to have been written by Peter, and when the Apocryphon of James claims to be written by James, and so on, I mean, this kind of self-representation really is clearly fiction. And it's kind of fascinating that the Gospels, especially the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, but to some extent Luke and John, resist that kind of attempt at a kind of explicit apostolic kind of claim to their own authority, and they're the ones that made it into the canon. So it is kind of a fascinating little historical fact. Well, thanks very much for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. There'll be another one along soon. Thanks to Lauren Goodacre for the intro today. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com, or you can Google for the NT Pod, or you can find me on Duke University's iTunes U. I look forward to being with you again soon.